Montana. Winter, 1947. When temperatures dropped to -40, livestock froze standing in the wind, and even the thickest log cabins felt like ice boxes. But in the middle of that valley, one man did something no one had ever seen before. He wrapped his entire cabin in metal. Neighbors laughed. Builders said, "That house will rot, freeze, and collapse before Christmas." Then the coldest winter in a century arrived. Every cabin struggled to stay alive, except one. While others burned 3 times more firewood and still shivered, that crazy cabin stayed up to 55 degrees warmer. So here's the question. What did one Montana homesteader understand about heat and wind that everyone else had missed for 70 years? Montana Territory, November 1947. There are winters that are inconvenient, and there are winters that correct human arrogance. This was the second kind. The kind that doesn't negotiate, doesn't reward effort, doesn't care how long your family has lived here. By late November, the Flathead Valley had already learned to lower its voice. Wind slid down from Glacier National Park like something alive, never violent all at once, just constant, pressing against walls, slipping through cracks, stealing warmth minute by minute. People didn't talk about temperature first. They talked about wood, how much you had, how fast it was disappearing, how many nights you could last if the road froze shut. Cabins dotted the valley like stubborn promises. Log walls, stone foundations, steep roofs built the way they'd always been built. Respectable, proven, familiar, and already losing the fight. Inside those cabins, mornings began with frost on the walls. Water buckets cracked overnight. Children slept in coats. Fires never rested. A cabin that held 45 degrees was considered warm enough. That was survival. 8 miles south of Kalispell, on land most men avoided because of wind exposure, Earl Hutchkins stood outside his cabin watching that winter arrive. He was 34. Former Army engineer, not a dreamer, not a preacher of new ideas. Just a man who had learned, the hard way, that cold doesn't care what you believe. His cabin was solid. 12-inch spruce logs, fieldstone foundation. Built by hand the previous summer. By local standards, it was better than most. And it was failing him. The winter before had nearly broken them. 4 cords of pine burned before February. Fires fed every 3 hours. Still, frost crept inside. His daughters slept wrapped in blankets and coats. Margaret stuffed rags into gaps every night and pulled them out frozen by morning. The cabin wasn't weak. Reality was stronger. Earl didn't blame the wood. He blamed the wind. And that single distinction, small, almost invisible, would put him on a path no one else in the valley was willing to take. Because in places like this, tradition feels safer than thinking. And thinking differently gets you laughed at. Everyone in Flathead Valley would have told you Earl Hutchkins did everything right. His cabin followed the rules, the same rules their fathers followed, and their grandfathers before them. Thick spruce logs, felled in winter so the sap ran low. Saddle-notched corners tight enough that daylight barely showed through. A stone foundation laid deep to keep frost from lifting it apart. A steep roof pitched to shed snow before it could crush the beams. If you judged cabins the way people always had, Earl's should have been one of the warmest in the valley. It wasn't. The first winter taught him that painfully. Cold didn't announce itself with drama. It arrived quietly, working through seams no one talked about. Not holes, paths, places where air didn't rush, but slid, whispered, pulled heat away faster than any fire could replace it. Earl noticed it most at night. He would wake before the fire went out, not from sound, but from cold creeping up through the floorboards. The logs radiated chill inward like damp stone. You could hold your hand inches from the wall and feel the heat draining out of your skin. By January, the cabin lived in a permanent state of effort. Someone was always feeding the stove. Someone was always hauling wood. Warmth lasted only as long as flame, and even then, barely. On good days, the thermometer crept to 45 degrees. On bad nights, it slipped into the 30s. Frost traced the interior walls like veins. Water buckets froze solid if left too close to the door. Earl began measuring things most men didn't bother measuring. How long heat lasted after a fresh log was added. How fast the temperature dropped when the wind picked up. Which walls felt colder, and when. The north wall lost heat fastest. Always had. Wind pressed against it day and night, stripping warmth away not by force, but by persistence. That's when the lie revealed itself. People believed thick walls were enough. They believed insulation meant mass. They believed cold came through the wood. But Earl saw something different. The cold wasn't coming through the logs. It was being pulled out of them. Wind didn't just chill the air. It scraped warmth directly off the surface of the cabin, molecule by molecule. The fire wasn't failing because it was too small. It was failing because the cabin was bleeding energy faster than it could be replaced. That realization was unsettling. Because if it was true, then the problem wasn't poor craftsmanship. It was the entire way people thought about heat. Earl had seen this before, years earlier, in a place most men in Montana had never heard of, the Aleutian Islands. Cold there wasn't dramatic either. It was relentless, wind-driven, wet. Army barracks made of thin metal shells held warmth better than log structures twice as thick. Not because metal insulated, but because wind never touched the living space directly. The shape mattered. The air mattered. Movement mattered. Back then, no one called it thermal design. They called it survival. Standing in his own freezing cabin, Earl realized something uncomfortable. Everything around him was built to resist cold. Nothing was built to stop wind. And as long as wind touched the walls, the battle was already lost. That thought stayed with him through spring, through summer, through every log he cut and stacked for the coming winter. By the time leaves turned again in 1947, Earl wasn't asking how to build a better cabin. He was asking a far more dangerous question. What if the cabin wasn't supposed to fight winter at all? What if it needed a shield? The idea didn't arrive all at once. It crept in. Earl Hutchkins wasn't the kind of man who sat at a table and sketched grand plans. He thought while working, while hauling timber, while fixing what broke. Ideas came to him the same way solutions had come during the war. Quietly, often unwanted, and usually inconvenient. In early October 1947, he rode north to Great Falls. The Army depot there was clearing out surplus, crates of equipment no longer needed, trucks, generators, and something Earl hadn't seen in years, Quonset huts, long, curved shells of corrugated steel, built fast, shipped everywhere, never meant to be beautiful, meant to work. Men at the depot laughed when he stopped in front of them. "Those aren't houses," one said. "Storage," another added. "Machinery sheds." Earl didn't argue. He walked around one slowly, hands running along the cold metal. He remembered standing inside similar structures in the Aleutians. Oil stove glowing faintly, wind screaming outside, yet the air inside remaining strangely calm. Not warm because of the walls, warm because nothing moved. That night, back at the homestead, he stood in the yard and looked at his cabin. Then he looked at the space around it. That's when the thought finally formed into words. What if the cabin never felt the wind at all? Not thicker logs, not bigger fires, not better stoves. Just no wind. The idea sounded wrong the moment he said it out loud. Wrap the cabin, not inside it, around it, a house inside another structure. He didn't think of it as building a home inside a Quonset hut. That's how others would describe it later. To Earl, it was simpler. The cabin would remain the cabin. The metal shell would be nothing more than a shield. 2 feet of space between them. Enough for air to sit still. Enough to block movement. Enough to change everything. When he mentioned it to Margaret, she didn't laugh. She didn't agree either. She just looked at him for a long moment. "People are going to think you've lost your mind," she said quietly. Earl nodded. "I know." He didn't tell anyone else. Not yet. The hut cost $75, more than he wanted to spend. Almost insulting, considering how little people thought of them. He hauled it home in sections over frozen ground. Steel ribs clanking, panels scraping, neighbors slowing their wagons to stare. By the time he began assembling it around the cabin, the valley had already decided what this was: a joke. Men stopped by pretending to be helpful, asking questions that weren't questions at all. "You ashamed of your own house? Metal sweats, Earl. You'll rot the logs. You've built yourself a tin coffin." Even his brother came. William stood in the yard, hands in his pockets, looking not angry, worried. "We've built cabins here for 70 years, he said. "If this worked, someone would have done it already." Earl didn't raise his voice. 70 years of freezing doesn't make something right. That was the moment the ridicule hardened. By late October, the structure stood complete. Curved steel arching over spruce logs, a dim corridor of air between them, vents cut carefully. Chimney flashing sealed twice, an airlock entry built so cold never rushed in all at once. From the road, it looked wrong. From the inside, it felt unfinished. Earl didn't celebrate. He didn't know if it would work. Winter would decide. And winter was already coming. Winter didn't arrive all at once. It tested first. The first snow came light, almost polite. Then the wind followed, low, constant, as if feeling its way around the strange new shape on Earl Hutchkin's land. The Quonset shell groaned softly at night as temperatures dropped, steel contracting, metal learning the cold. Inside the cabin, nothing dramatic happened. That was unsettling. No sudden warmth, no miracle, just steadiness. Earl watched the thermometer more than he slept. 48, 50, 52. Temperatures that would have required constant feeding before now held on longer than expected. When the fire burned low, the cabin cooled, but slowly, reluctantly, like it didn't want to let go. By the third night, something else became clear. The walls felt different. Not warm to the touch, but no longer hostile. You could lean near them without feeling heat pulled from your skin. The usual chill zones, north wall, corners, floor edges, had softened. Margaret noticed before Earl said anything. "The house doesn't feel angry anymore," she said one evening. That was the best description either of them could find. Outside, the valley hardened. Wind carved drifts. Chimneys roared. People began burning through wood faster than planned, telling themselves it was still early, still manageable. No one came to check on Earl. Not yet. The first week ended without failure. That worried him more than success, because real winter hadn't started. December erased doubt. On the 8th, Arctic air poured down from Alberta and didn't leave. Temperatures fell hard, then stayed there. -10, -20, then worse. Wind chill numbers stopped meaning anything because exposed skin simply hurt. This was the winter people remembered. Livestock froze standing. Chickens died despite lanterns. Water froze indoors. Cabins turned into endurance chambers where warmth lasted only as long as flame. At the Hutchkins place, something strange happened. Nothing changed. Earl fed the stove as usual, sometimes less. Sometimes forgot a cycle entirely and woke to 58 degrees. The cabin never surged with heat, but it never collapsed either. That consistency was terrifying, because it shouldn't have been possible. One night, with the outside temperature at -38, Earl banked the stove and went to bed without adding wood. 8 hours later, the cabin still sat above 55. That was when he understood. The cabin wasn't fighting winter anymore. It was insulated from urgency. Heat stayed because it had nowhere to go quickly. Wind never touched the logs. Air in the gap barely moved. The cabin itself became a thermal mass, slowly releasing stored warmth instead of bleeding it away. Elsewhere, families were burning half a cord a week just to stay above freezing. Earl was burning a fraction of that. Still, no one said anything. People don't believe quiet evidence. The first sign was smoke, or rather, the lack of it. While chimneys across the valley poured black plumes day and night, Earl's released only a thin, steady thread. Like October, not December. Calvin Drecker noticed first. He stopped by with spare wood, expecting trouble. Margaret answered the door in normal clothes. Behind her, the girls sat at the table. No coats, no blankets. Calvin stepped inside and felt it. Not hot. Just normal. 63, Earl said, nodding at the thermometer. Calvin checked it himself. Outside, -38. Inside, livable. Word spread fast after that, faster than wind. Men came skeptical, left quiet. No arguments, no apologies, just recalculations happening behind tired eyes. By New Year's, the joke was over. Winter had chosen a side. Imitation came next, and failure followed it closely. Some wrapped metal directly against logs and trapped moisture. Others sealed air gaps too tightly and built rot instead of warmth. A few copied the look without understanding the movement of air. Their cabins stayed cold. The valley nearly dismissed the idea entirely, until one man copied the principle instead of the structure. He left an air gap, added slow ventilation, stopped wind before it touched living space. His fuel use dropped immediately. That was the lesson winter enforced without mercy. You can't borrow results without understanding causes. Those who respected physics survived better. Those who chased appearances failed quietly. Earl Hutchkins didn't invent insulation. He remembered something older. Cold doesn't defeat you with strength. It defeats you with movement. The smartest solutions don't look brave. They look strange. They get laughed at until they work. That winter didn't reward tradition. It rewarded understanding. And that's why the people who survive the longest are often the ones everyone thought were wrong. Because on the frontier, wisdom isn't about being right first. It's about staying warm when it matters.